There comes a moment in life when the quietest soul, the one who has carried the most, finally rises, not in anger, not in revenge, but in truth. This is that moment. If you have felt deeply, loved fiercely, absorbed pain that was never yours to hold, and walked through life with an open heart in a world that often felt too sharp, then hear this clearly. Your sensitivity was never your weakness. It was your initiation. And now it is becoming your power. For so long, empaths have been taught subtly or directly that they are too much, too emotional, too sensitive, too soft, too easily affected. You learned early how to read a room, how to sense the unspoken, how to carry the emotional weight of others, not because you wanted to, but because you had to. Somewhere along the way, survival trained you to be attuned, vigilant, deeply aware, and instead of being honored for this, you were often drained by it. But what if the very traits that exhausted you were never meant to be used in service of abandonment, especially self-abandonment? What if your empathy was never designed to keep you small, silent, or stuck, but to guide you back to yourself? The empath's pain is rarely loud. It accumulates quietly. It shows up as chronic self-doubt, as overgiving, as staying too long in places that hurt because leaving would cause someone else discomfort. It shows up as guilt for wanting more, for needing rest, for drawing boundaries. Many empaths learned that love meant sacrifice. That safety came from being needed. That connection required losing parts of themselves. Over time, the body remembers this. The nervous system adapts, and what once was coping becomes exhaustion. Yet something profound happens when awareness enters the picture. You begin to notice the cost. You feel the burnout, the resentment, the quiet grief of a life lived for everyone else. And instead of blaming yourself, you start asking a different question. What happened to me? Not, what's wrong with me, but what shaped me this way? That question changes everything. Because when you understand that your empathy was forged in environments where you had to be emotionally alert to stay safe, shame begins to dissolve. You realize you were responding intelligently to circumstances that required sensitivity. Your nervous system was doing its job. Your heart was adapting. And now, as an adult, you are no longer required to live in survival mode. This is where the comeback begins. The empath's comeback is not about becoming harder. It's about becoming more rooted. It's about learning that compassion does not require self-erasure, that love does not demand suffering, that boundaries are not walls. They are acts of clarity. When an empath learns to say no without guilt, to pause without apology, to choose themselves without justification, something powerful unfolds. Energy returns. Clarity sharpens. The fog lifts. You start to feel your own needs as clearly as you once felt everyone else's emotions. You stop confusing intensity with intimacy. You stop mistaking familiarity for safety. You begin to recognize that peace feels different from chaos, and you no longer feel bored by it. This is not a betrayal of who you are. It is a homecoming. As empaths heal, they stop being magnets for dysfunction, not because they've lost their sensitivity, but because they've gained discernment. They no longer pour into empty vessels. They no longer negotiate their worth. They no longer explain their pain to those committed to misunderstanding it. Instead, they listen to their body, their limits, their truth, and the world feels that shift. People respond differently to an empath who is regulated, grounded, and self-respecting. The old dynamics fall away. Some relationships end. Others transform. New ones emerge, rooted in mutual presence rather than emotional extraction. The empath begins to take up space, not loudly, but solidly. And that presence carries weight. This comeback doesn't look like domination or dominance. It looks like embodiment. It looks like an empath who trusts their inner signals, who no longer overrides their intuition for the sake of harmony. It looks like someone who knows that their sensitivity is a form of intelligence, one that can guide, heal, and create, but only when it is protected. And here is the truth that changes everything. The world does not need fewer empaths. It needs empaths who are not depleted. It needs people who can feel deeply without drowning, who can care without collapsing, who can love without losing themselves. That kind of empath becomes a force. So this is your moment. Not to fix everyone, not to prove anything, but to reclaim yourself. To honor the child who learned to feel too much because they had no other choice. To soothe the nervous system that has been on high alert for too long. To choose relationships that feel safe, work that feels elatingful, and a life that feels like it belongs to you. Your empathy is not fading, it is maturing. Your softness is not disappearing, it is stabilizing. Your comeback is not about becoming someone else, it is about finally becoming whole. Now take this awareness and turn it into action. Start today by choosing one boundary you've been avoiding. One truth you've been silencing. One act of self-respect you've been postponing. Protect your energy as fiercely as you once protected others. Build a life that can hold your depth without draining it. Step forward not as the version of you that survived, but as the version of you that is ready to live. others. Build a life that can hold your depth without draining it. Step forward not as the version of you that survived, but as the version of you that is ready to live. An empath's journey always begins long before adulthood, long before conscious choice, in spaces where emotional awareness was not a luxury but a necessity. Sensitivity did not arise because life was gentle, it arose because life demanded vigilance. The empath learned early how to scan faces, tones, silences, and shifts in energy, because understanding the emotional climate was a way to stay safe, connected, or needed. This capacity to feel deeply was not a personality trait chosen for comfort. It was a nervous system adaptation shaped by environment. When this truth is not understood, the empath grows up believing they are simply wired wrong, too intense, too emotional, too reactive, and they carry shame for something that was once an intelligent response to circumstance. The first step in transformation is recognizing that empathy often develops in response to emotional unpredictability. When caregivers were overwhelmed, unavailable, volatile, or emotionally inconsistent, till the child learned to compensate. The child became the listener, the peacekeeper, the emotional translator. They learned to sense distress before it was spoken, to anticipate needs before they were expressed, to manage the emotional temperature of the room. This was not emotional maturity, it was emotional survival. And yet, as adults, many empaths continue to live as if the original conditions still exist, as if their worth depends on how well they can feel, fix, or carry others. Without awareness, this pattern becomes exhausting. The empath overextends, overgives, and over-identifies with the pain of others. They confuse responsibility with compassion. They mistake emotional intensity for connection. They remain hyper-attuned to others, while remaining disconnected from themselves. Over time, this leads to burnout, resentment, anxiety, and a deep sense of emptiness that cannot be filled by external validation. The body begins to protest through fatigue, tension, or emotional numbness, signaling that something is no longer sustainable. Understanding the origin of empathy changes the internal narrative. Instead of asking, "Why am I like this?" the empath begins to ask, "What did I need to become in order to survive?" This shift removes self-blame and replaces it with context. Sensitivity is no longer seen as a flaw, but as a learned strength that has simply been overused. And what is learned can be unlearned, reshaped, and regulated. This realization alone begins to soften the nervous system, because the internal war against one's own nature comes to an end. As awareness grows, the empath starts to notice how old patterns replay in present relationships. They may feel drawn to emotionally unavailable people, believing that love requires effort and endurance. They may feel guilty for setting limits, as if boundaries are acts of rejection rather than acts of care. They may feel anxious when there is emotional distance, interpreting calm as danger, because chaos once meant connection. These patterns are not evidence of weakness. They are echoes of earlier conditioning, asking to be understood, not obeyed. The body plays a central role in this awakening. Empaths often live in their heads, analyzing emotions rather than feeling their own physical cues. Reconnecting with the body reveals signals that were long ignored: tightness when saying yes too quickly, heaviness when staying silent, exhaustion after emotional labor that was never requested. Learning to listen to these signals is an act of reparenting. It teaches the nervous system that it no longer needs to be on constant alert, that safety can exist without hypervigilance. With this understanding comes a crucial distinction. Empathy does not mean absorption. Feeling with someone is different from carrying their emotional weight. Compassion does not require self-sacrifice. When empaths learn this, they begin to separate what belongs to them from what does not. They realize that another person's discomfort is not automatically their responsibility, that fixing is not the same as loving, and that presence does not require depletion. This differentiation is subtle, but life-altering, because it allows empathy to flow without draining the self. Another layer of this process involves grieving. Empaths often avoid grief because they have spent a lifetime holding everyone else's pain. Yet healing requires mourning what was missed, the safety that was inconsistent, the validation that was conditional, the childhood that required emotional labor instead of carefree presence. Allowing this grief to surface is not indulgent, it is restorative. It acknowledges the cost of becoming who you had to be, and creates space for becoming who you are now. As this internal clarity deepens, the empath begins to experience a quiet but profound shift in identity. They stop defining themselves solely by how much they can give or feel. They begin to ask what they want, what nourishes them, what feels aligned. These questions may initially feel unfamiliar or even selfish, but they are essential. They signal the transition from survival-based empathy to conscious empathy. One is driven by fear of disconnection. The other is guided by choice and self-respect. This awareness also reshapes how the empath relates to others' emotions. Instead of immediately merging with another's pain, they can witness it with steadiness. Instead of rushing to soothe, they can pause and assess. This does not make them colder, it makes them clearer. Their empathy becomes grounded rather than reactive, intentional rather than compulsive. And in this grounded state, empathy becomes sustainable. The most powerful aspect of this key shift is the reclaiming of agency. The empath realizes they are no longer the child in the room, dependent on emotional harmony for survival. They are an adult with choices, limits, and autonomy. Their sensitivity no longer controls them, it informs them. Their awareness no longer traps them, it liberates them. And from this place, a new relationship with empathy begins to form. One rooted in understanding rather than obligation, in presence rather than self-erasure. Is this conversation helpful so far? As awareness deepens, the empath begins to encounter one of the most difficult but transformative lessons of all, the necessity of boundaries, not the rigid defensive kind that shut the world out, but living boundaries that define where one person ends and another begins. For many empaths, boundaries feel unnatural at first. They were not modeled early in life. In fact, closeness may have depended on the absence of boundaries. Love may have been intertwined with emotional enmeshment, where saying no felt dangerous and prioritizing oneself felt like abandonment. Because of this, boundaries can initially trigger anxiety, guilt, and fear of rejection. The empath may notice an internal conflict arise the moment they consider asserting a limit. A voice surfaces saying it's selfish, unkind, or unnecessary. Another voice warns that the relationship might suffer, that harmony will be lost, that they will be seen as difficult or cold. This inner struggle is not a sign that boundaries are wrong. It is evidence that the nervous system is still operating from an old template where safety depended on emotional compliance. The body remembers a time when needs were inconvenient and silence was rewarded. Learning to set boundaries therefore requires more than intellectual understanding. It requires nervous system regulation. When an empath says no for the first time, their heart may race, their stomach may tighten, and their mind may flood with justifications. The impulse to explain, soften, or retract the boundary is strong. This reaction is not weakness, it is conditioning. The body is testing whether the world will collapse if the old pattern is broken. Each time the empath holds the boundary, and nothing catastrophic happens, the nervous system learns something new. Limits do not equal danger. Over time, boundaries become less about pushing others away and more about staying connected to oneself. The empath begins to feel the difference between generosity and depletion. They notice when giving feels open and when it feels obligatory. They recognize that resentment is often a signal of an unspoken boundary, not a flaw in character. Instead of ignoring this signal, they start listening to it. Resentment becomes information, pointing to places where self-respect has been compromised. Another important realization emerges. Boundaries do not require permission. Many empaths wait for validation before honoring their limits. They hope the other person will understand, agree, or change on their own. When this doesn't happen, the empath feels trapped, believing they must either tolerate the discomfort or walk away entirely. Learning boundaries introduces a third option, staying while staying true to oneself. This is unfamiliar territory. It means allowing others to feel disappointed without rushing to fix it. It means tolerating the discomfort of being misunderstood. It means trusting that relationships rooted in authenticity can survive honesty. As boundaries strengthen, relationships naturally begin to shift. Some people respond with respect, adjusting their behavior and meeting the empath in a more balanced dynamic. Others resist, becoming defensive, dismissive, or manipulative. This can be painful, especially for empaths who equate conflict with loss. Yet this stage is revealing. It shows which relationships were sustained by overgiving and which can adapt to mutuality. The empath begins to see that not every connection is meant to be preserved at the cost of self-betrayal. This process also brings the empath into closer contact with their own needs. Needs that were long minimized or postponed start to surface. The need for rest without explanation, for solitude without guilt, for expression without caretaking. At first, these needs may feel overwhelming or confusing. The empath may not know how to meet them because their attention has always been outward. Learning to identify and honor these needs is a practice, one that requires patience and curiosity rather than judgment. Self-regulation becomes central here. Instead of relying on external harmony to feel safe, the empath learns to create internal stability. This may involve slowing down, noticing breath, grounding in the body, or simply pausing before responding. These small acts interrupt the automatic urge to absorb and react. They create space between stimulus and response, allowing choice to enter. In that space, the empath can decide how much to engage, when to step back, and what feels aligned. As this capacity grows, empathy itself begins to change in quality. It becomes less porous and more contained. The empath can feel another's pain without drowning in it. They can listen without fixing. They can be present without losing themselves. This form of empathy is steadier, clearer, and far more sustainable. It does not come from obligation, but from grounded compassion. It respects both the other person's autonomy and one's own limits. An unexpected shift often follows. Increased clarity about values. When energy is no longer drained by constant emotional labor, the empath gains access to deeper questions. What matters to me? What kind of relationships do I want? What kind of life feels nourishing rather than exhausting? These questions were always there, but they were drowned out by the noise of others' needs. Now, with boundaries in place, the empath can hear themselves more clearly. This clarity extends to time and energy as well. Empaths often struggle with overcommitment, saying yes to too much and then feeling overwhelmed. Boundaries with time are just as important as emotional boundaries. Learning to leave space in the calendar, to rest before exhaustion sets in, to prioritize recovery as much as productivity, reshapes the empath's relationship with their own vitality. Energy becomes something to steward rather than sacrifice. There is also a subtle shift in self-perception. The empath stops seeing themselves as responsible for maintaining emotional balance in every interaction. They recognize that other adults are capable of managing their own feelings. This does not mean indifference. It means trust in others, resilience and trust in one's own worth beyond usefulness. The empath begins to experience a sense of dignity that comes from self-respect rather than self-denial. This stage can feel lonely at times. Old patterns offered a sense of belonging, even if it was costly. Stepping out of them may initially create space where familiar dynamics once lived. Yet this space is not emptiness, it is potential. It is room for relationships that are reciprocal, for creativity that was suppressed, for rest that was overdue. In this space, the empath starts to experience a quieter form of fulfillment, one that does not rely on constant emotional exchange. Boundaries also teach the empath discernment. Not every emotion needs to be engaged with. Not every story needs to be entered. Not every request requires an answer. This discernment is not coldness. It is wisdom earned through experience. It allows empathy to be directed where it is truly welcomed and effective, rather than scattered everywhere out of fear. As this way of being settles in, the empath's presence changes. There is less urgency, less reactivity, less emotional leakage. Others may notice a calm strength, a groundedness that was not there before. This presence is not performative. It arises naturally when the empath is no longer divided against themselves. Their sensitivity remains intact, but it is now supported by structure, awareness, and choice. What emerges here is a different relationship with power, not power over others, but power within oneself. The power to choose engagement, to step back, to speak up, to rest. This power was always available, but it was inaccessible when empathy was driven by fear and conditioning. As boundaries become embodied, the empath begins to inhabit this power quietly, steadily, without needing to announce it, without needing approval, without needing to disappear to maintain connection. As the empath integrates awareness and boundaries, a deeper transformation begins to take shape. The shift from surviving through empathy to living through embodied authenticity. This stage is not about learning something new, as much as it is about releasing what no longer serves. The empath starts to sense that their identity has long been organized around responsiveness, rather than truth. They were defined by availability, by emotional usefulness, by how well they could adapt to others. Now a quieter question emerges beneath the surface. Who am I when I am not responding, fixing, or holding space for someone else? At first, this question can feel destabilizing. When empathy has been the primary organizing principle of the self, loosening its grip can create a temporary sense of emptiness. The empath may feel unsure of their direction, their preferences, even their voice. This is not regression, it is recalibration. The nervous system is learning to exist without constant external reference points. For the first time, the empath begins to orient inward, not to analyze, but to listen. This listening reveals long-suppressed impulses, creative urges that were postponed because they did not serve anyone else, desires that were minimized because they seemed impractical or indulgent, anger that was swallowed because it threatened connection, grief that was deferred because there was no room for it. As these emotions surface, the empath may feel overwhelmed, not because they are too intense, but because they were held back for so long. Allowing them to move through without judgment becomes a form of liberation. Embodiment plays a crucial role here. Empaths often intellectualize their healing, understanding patterns, but remaining disconnected from sensation. Embodiment invites a different approach. It asks the empath to notice how truth feels in the body, expansion versus contraction, ease versus tension, aliveness versus numbness. Decisions are no longer made solely through empathy for others, but through resonance with oneself. This is a profound reorientation, one that restores trust in inner signals that were long overridden. As self-trust grows, the empath's expression begins to change. They speak more slowly, more directly, less defensively. They no longer preface their truth with apologies or disclaimers. Silence becomes a choice rather than a reflex. When they do speak, it comes from alignment rather than urgency. This authenticity may surprise those who are accustomed to the empath's constant accommodation. Some may interpret it as distance, others may feel challenged by it. The empath learns to tolerate these reactions without collapsing back into old patterns. Another significant shift occurs in how the empath relates to purpose. Previously, purpose may have been defined by service alone, by being needed, by alleviating suffering. While care remains important, it is no longer the sole measure of meaning. The empath begins to explore purpose as self-expression, as contribution that flows from fullness rather than depletion. They may feel drawn to create, to teach, to build, to advocate, or simply to live in a way that models presence and integrity. Purpose becomes less about fixing the world and more about inhabiting one's place within it. This stage also brings a new relationship with vulnerability. The empath no longer exposes themselves indiscriminately, mistaking openness for intimacy. Vulnerability becomes selective and grounded. It is shared with those who have demonstrated safety, consistency, and reciprocity. This discernment protects the empath's depth, allowing it to be met rather than exploited. Emotional intimacy becomes a mutual exchange rather than a one-sided offering. As the empath settles into this authenticity, their nervous system continues to reorganize. Hypervigilance softens. The baseline state shifts from alertness to presence. Rest becomes deeper. Joy becomes more accessible, not the ecstatic kind fueled by offense, connection, or approval, but a steady, quiet sense of being at home in oneself. This joy does not depend on circumstances. It arises from coherence between inner truth and outer life. Relationships reflect this coherence. The empath attracts different dynamics now. People who thrive on imbalance may drift away, while those capable of mutuality move closer. Conversations become richer, less charged, more real. Conflict, when it arises, is navigated with honesty rather than fear. The empath discovers that disagreement does not have to mean disconnection, and that being fully seen requires being fully present, even when it is uncomfortable. There is also a reckoning with power. Empaths often underestimate their influence, having learned to minimize themselves. As they become more embodied, they may notice that their words carry weight. Their presence affects others. Their choices shape environments. This realization can be unsettling at first. Power was once associated with harm or domination. Now it is reclaimed as responsibility and agency. The empath learns to wield their influence with intention, grounded in values rather than guilt. This phase invites integration rather than polarization. Sensitivity and strength are no longer opposites. Compassion and clarity coexist. The empath no longer swings between over-involvement and withdrawal. Instead, there is a steady center from which engagement arises naturally. This integration allows the empath to remain open without being porous, caring without being consumed, responsive without being reactive. Another layer of healing involves rewriting internal narratives about worth. The empath begins to disentangle value from usefulness. They no longer measure their importance by how much they give or how deeply they feel. Worth becomes inherent rather than conditional. This shift is subtle but radical. It frees the empath from constant self-monitoring and performance. Life becomes less about proving and more about experiencing. As this unfolds, the empath may feel called to environments that support this way of being. This could mean changes in work, community, or lifestyle. Loud, chaotic spaces may feel less appealing, while places that honor rhythm, depth, and authenticity feel nourishing. These changes are not escapes, they are alignments. The empath is choosing contexts that support regulation rather than demand sacrifice. There is also a growing capacity to sit with uncertainty. Empaths often seek resolution quickly because unresolved tension feels unbearable. With healing, they learn to tolerate ambiguity without rushing to soothe it. This patience allows life to unfold more organically. Decisions are made with timing rather than urgency. Trust replaces control. The empath no longer needs to anticipate every emotional outcome to feel safe. This stage is marked by a quiet confidence that does not announce itself. The empath does not need to explain their growth or justify their choices. They simply live differently. Their presence carries a sense of groundedness that others can feel. This presence is not performative or strategic. It is the natural result of alignment between inner experience and outer expression. What ultimately emerges is an empath who is no longer defined by wounds or coping strategies, but by wholeness. Their sensitivity is still there, but it is now integrated into a larger sense of self. They are no longer shaped primarily by what they endured, but by what they have chosen to become. This is not a dramatic transformation marked by sudden enlightenment. It is a gradual settling into truth, a steady inhabiting of one's own life. In this place, empathy becomes a gift rather than a burden. It flows from abundance, guided by wisdom, anchored in self-respect. The empath is no longer trying to earn belonging through emotional labor. They belong to themselves first, and from that belonging, everything else follows naturally, quietly, and with a depth that no longer costs them their own center.